Firstly, thank you for the invite. I kind of appreciate the invite, as you say, to talk a little bit more about the work that we're undertaking in respect of the climate change strategy, but also I think the wider work we're doing in respect to the environment as well. So, interested to hear what you had to say. Then in terms of all the pieces of work and projects that you're looking to kind of bring forward under the climate change work. So hopefully what I'm going to say today, I'm covering a range of issues in terms of updating you on. So to start with, I'm going to just do a few kind of facts and figures just to set a scene in terms of the environment in Buckinghamshire. There's a kind of a section about the kind of climate change strategy in terms of what's in there. And then I'm going to cover, I suppose, some of the other projects that we're looking to kind of deliver upon in respect of the natural environment and why I'm kind of focusing all those together. So yes, the climate change strategy is about reducing carbon emissions, but that can't be looked in isolation. So in terms of the work we're doing about the wider natural environment, for me, it is one part of an overall issue in terms of how we address nature's decline as well and how we look at the environment as one. So that's kind of how I've structured just the presentation that kind of outlines the work we're doing on a number of fronts in respect of climate change and environment. So I hope I've kind of pitched it right in terms of the areas that you're interested in terms of how we then may work together going ahead. So that's what I'm looking to cover. So as kind of Ed said, yes, kind of head of climate change and environment. So clearly I don't profess to have all the technical knowledge, but we have a number of specialist teams kind of underneath who have been working towards delivering a variety of the kind of things that we're looking to deliver. So just to start with, in terms of just setting out, I suppose, a bit of the state of the environment, a bit of a scene setter. I'm just going to cover a few facts and figures just in terms of Buckinghamshire's environment as we are. So currently only 30% of woodland cover in Buckinghamshire. But an interesting figure, we'll be well aware of the issue of ash dieback. So currently forecast to kill probably 95% of our ash trees. So that's going to have a huge impact on our landscape and how we kind of factor that in terms of how we manage our landscape moving ahead in terms of a changing climate. And you'll be aware that's kind of one of the government's ambitions in terms of increasing the amount of woodland cover, partly in terms of its response to kind of climate change, in terms of the role of trees in its response. Turning to our rivers, again, we're blessed with our chalk streams, within the Chilterns and a whole variety of other rivers and catchments across Buckinghamshire, but none of our rivers are in good overall health status in Buckinghamshire, both from a kind of an ecological and kind of chemical point of view. So that includes all of our chalk streams, which is really not in a good place to be. We're not unique. I think that picture is reflected across the country. So having made years of good progress in respect of our rivers, none of our rivers are in good overall health status. And we'll be well aware last, I think, year in terms of the acute pressure that our rivers were under in terms of, the drying up of a number of our chalk streams. So we're well aware of that, as a critical issue of our environment. And then turning to the other aspect of, I suppose water and kind of the impact of kind of climate change. This is a picture from Marlow in terms of, I think, the 2013-14 floods. We've got over 9,000 properties at risk of a 100-year flood in Bucks. And I think that the last winter, again, we've just, I think, realised the impact that I suppose flooding is having and the increasing frequency this is now having in respect of across the board, but certainly in Bucks in the last winter, we've experienced significant flooding across the county, both in surface water, fluvial, and not forgetting kind of groundwater as well. And we've seen kind of the intensity of rainfall increase. So the impact of surface water flooding is starting to become a real issue. So this is kind of one of the issues we're having to start to think about in terms of how we are addressing our response to kind of climate change as well from a flooding perspective. From Marlow's perspective, obviously a scheme has now been implemented to address flooding in Marlow, but that was just an overview in terms of how obviously it impacted that particular town in kind of 2013-14. And then Ed talked about the issues of biodiversity. you know, the UK apparently is one of the most kind of nature depleted kind of countries. You know, 56% of our UK species have declined over recent decades, and 15% are thought to be extinct. And biodiversity is at the heart of our ecosystems. This is what makes them function in terms of, so this is kind of critically important in terms of understanding how our ecosystems work and the role they play. So, you know, this is something we really have to get on top of. So as well as obviously the issue in terms of bringing down our carbon emissions, we have to obviously address the I suppose the impact of kind of nature's decline and how we're dealing with nature and the role that ecosystems play. So that's a bit of a kind of a summary in terms of a bit of a scene setter. Yes, there have been good things that have happened in terms of, you know, how our kind of carbon emissions have come down as kind of we moved away from you know, coal-based to more renewable-based, but that's more of a scene setter regarding the wider environment as it is now. Just turning to, I suppose policy in terms of national policy. So again, I've kind of focused here very much on the kind of the natural environment, but clearly the I suppose the key one driving this is the kind of Climate Change Act, which is obviously provides you know, there's a legal commitment now that commits the government to net zero emissions by 2050. So the original obviously act was changed a couple of years ago to ensure that it was net zero by 2050. So that's, you know, a legally binding obligation on the government, and probably at the time was relatively unique in the world in respect of it being a legally, I suppose, binding the government to meet that. Following that, obviously, there's been a series of kind of government policies that are supporting the implementation of that. So obviously the government's own kind of climate change advisors, it's working to kind of carbon budgets that in terms of setting out how it's going to get to net zero. But specifically on the environment, you know, we've had the publication of the government's 25-year environment plan. We've got the environment bill that's kind of currently going through Parliament that will introduce biodiversity net gain into the planning system. And also within the environment bill, we have the requirement to produce local nature recovery strategies, which I will come on to shortly. We've had the publication of the England's Tree Strategy, which sets out the government's ambitions in respect of trees in numerous ways. But again, that's its overall ambition to be planting, I think, 30,000 hectares of trees per year. And then we've had the agricultural bill, which again is going to be really important in terms of how we manage land. So as we've kind of moved away, or as we are moving away from the common agricultural policy in terms of single payments to kind of landowners, we're going to be moving much more to a system that rewards, I suppose, land managers for delivering environmental goods, so public goods. So that's a real shift in terms of policy. So that's kind of the overall kind of policy kind of framework that we're kind of working towards on the environment side. Clearly, there's other aspects that we'll be aware of that support other aspects of kind of climate change, but that's the focus, what I call on the natural environment. So turning specifically to the council's, I suppose, draft climate change strategy. So just, I suppose, rolling back to, I suppose, when the unitary formed. So the unitary formed, Buckinghamshire Council unitary formed in April of last year. And that brought together, I suppose, obviously what were the 5 previous authorities. And in July of last year, there was a motion that was put to the full council in respect of climate change. And I think it was at that motion, it then committed the authority to pull together a draft strategy to present back to Cabinet, full Cabinet in February of this year. So that set out the overall, that motion in July of last year set out in terms of I suppose the ambition, the strategic approach, and effectively asked the officers to go away and pull together a draft strategy to present back to Cabinet in February, which is what we have done. And to do that, obviously, we undertook a kind of an audit in terms of understanding what our emissions were as an authority to help inform what our journey to net zero would look like. So the overall ambition is kind of set by the council last July was to effectively achieve net zero carbon emissions for Buckinghamshire as a whole by 2050. specifically for Buckinghamshire Council, to achieve net zero carbon emissions for the Buckinghamshire Council. So this is us operating as an authority in respect of our buildings and the services we deliver, no later than 2050, but potentially as early as 2030. So that was the overall ambition, I suppose the headline ambition within the strategy. And it then sets out, I suppose, the different role that the council plays in addressing kind of, I suppose, climate change. And I've kind of then separated those out, or the strategy kind of separates that out into our relationship with, I suppose, with emissions. So, you know, we have a role to play in terms of our own direct emissions. So, i.e. the buildings we operate, where we can, you know, take action in respect of, you know, our heating systems by installing more solar panels, so on and so forth. So, and other building measures. So things that we have a direct control upon. There's then where we have a regulatory role. So I'm thinking here in particular of our role in terms of our local planning authority, but also in terms of our role as a local transport authority. So we have a role there as a regulatory body, and we can also enable change in terms of helping enable, I suppose, the provision, for instance, of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And then there's the informing and influencing, where we can, I suppose, raise public awareness of climate change and how do we help influence and enable change to happen as well. So they were the approaches that this kind of the strategy is set out. And the strategy itself contains, I suppose, a set of 60 draft actions in terms of that kind of sets out under all those categories in terms of how we're going to address climate change, looking at our own emissions, those of our suppliers. So you'll be aware that obviously that, you know, some of our services we deliver direct, some of our services are contracted out, and how do we work with those contractors? But also in terms of how do we then work with partners in terms of Buckinghamshire's wider emissions, recognising that, you know, many of those wider emissions are going to be obviously directly delivered by national policy in a lot of those instances. Some of the actions that are kind of coming forward, you know, there's a whole suite of actions, and I'll come on to those in a little bit more detail in terms of our own buildings. But there's a large-scale tree planting programme across our own estate of you know, over 500,000 trees. That's one for kind of every resident. How we can work with communities, you know, particularly, you know, our community boards. How do we work through our community boards to help you know, address communities, you know, more local kind of delivery. Improving our infrastructure for active travel, such as walking and cycling and electric vehicles. Also looking at our own fleet. You know, we operate our own vehicles, and how do we then look at our own fleet in terms of reducing emissions from our own fleet of vehicles that we operate. And as I mentioned earlier about, obviously, opportunities in terms of planning policy. You know, we're about to embark on a you know, a new local plan for Buckinghamshire. How do we, in terms of incorporate best practice in terms of you know, in terms of the policies that we're looking to implement as part of the Buckinghamshire local plan to deliver the changes that we would like to see. So there's a whole range of actions in there. You know, we have set ambitious, but we believe achievable targets. So what we've not just done is kind of said, well, we want to deliver you know, that particular target. We've kind of worked through what we think is possible. We've kind of costed it out, and we've tried to be ambitious in terms of how we get there. So we've kind of mirrored the government's kind of carbon budgets kind of cycle, but we've set targets for ourselves for, and this is I suppose our own targets in terms of reducing the council's emissions. So by, you know, 2030, we're looking for at least a 75% reduction compared to 1990 levels, and for 2040 at least a 90% reduction on 1990 levels, and we've specifically aligned it so that aligns with the UK's national targets, which are based on 1990 emission levels. So that is more ambitious than the government's set target. So I think recently they announced a kind of a 68% national commitment by 2030. So, you know, looking at setting ourselves a target for ourselves, that sets out, I suppose, the ambition of how we're looking to get to net zero as an authority, just to put that into context. Just quickly about the tree planting. So yes, there's a commitment in terms of planting one tree for every resident in Buckinghamshire over the next 10 years. Realistically, I suspect 75% of that will be done over the next 5 years. We're predominantly looking at our own land holdings for that in terms of our agriculture estate. So over 200 hectares of land. And we've been working with the Forestry Commission to identify, the right tree in the right place. Where does it make sense to do this from an environmental perspective, but also recognizing that the role that they will play in terms of helping offset our emissions. By once fully, I suppose, implemented, it will have the ability to absorb over 60,000 tons of carbon from the atmosphere, and will help us achieve, I suppose, our net zero emissions. And they will, I suppose, in terms of how they're going to be designed, fundamentally will be about delivering, I suppose, multiple benefits. This is not just about putting trees in to absorb carbon. This is about designing them to achieve multiple benefits in terms of access, flood alleviation, biodiversity, in terms of how we create these. So fundamentally, that's what we're looking to do with this. And that's not to say we're also looking with community boards in terms of how we can help support local aspirations for tree planting as well. A quick overview of the measures that we're looking to kind of implement. There's a whole suite of measures in there in terms of building measures. So, for instance, in terms of continuing with replacing, the heating controls, how we heat our buildings, roof-mounted PV. We look at the new Chiltern, lifestyle centre that's being built. We've been awarded funding in terms of putting solar panels on there, in terms of the heating system. So there's a whole suite of measures that we can do in respect to building measures. Solar carports, we've identified potentially a number of sites in terms of public car parks that are close to council buildings where this may be appropriate in terms of feeding into our buildings in terms of the solar panels. Street lighting, we think we've probably got another 3 years to be able to kind of complete the kind of switching out of our street lights to LED. And the payback on that is really good in terms of 5 years. That's a really good investment to make. And then, as I mentioned before, in terms of our fleet, how are we moving towards looking at our fleet in terms of moving that towards more low emission fleet. We've got more difficult aspects of our fleet. We run a fleet of either ourselves or through contractors in terms of waste collection vehicles. Clearly that's a lot more difficult, and I suspect the solutions of that are going to be much farther down the line. I'm aware that some authorities are testing solutions to this, but that's clearly something I think farther down the line. But other aspects of our fleet might be easier to switch over earlier, so that's something that we'll also be looking at as well. And then I've talked about the kind of the tree planting in there as well. And there's another element in terms of where we procure our electricity from as well. That's another aspect we'll be looking at. All of these, which we need to kind of be worked up in more detail, but they're the things we kind of said, look, we've costed this out, we've identified how much they can deliver, and this is our route as an authority to net zero. So that's kind of the what we've kind of pulled together in respect of, I suppose, the outline kind of climate change strategy. So what I'll come to now is a section in terms of the local nature recovery strategy. So as well as the issue of, I suppose, reducing our emissions, in terms of which is important, we also talked about the issue, I suppose, of nature's decline, and fundamental, I suppose, to me, this is of equal, if not of importance, in terms of we're fundamentally reliant on the things that nature provides to us, whether that's pollination, our food, our clean water, our clean air, the ability to absorb carbon, and also the ability to regulate the climate as well. So this is equally important in terms of I suppose our local nature, in terms of how it is managed, and the issues we've had in terms of its kind of decline and degradation. And yes, we have some wonderful landscapes in Buckinghamshire, but yes, nature is highly fragile. and I've highlighted, I think, the decline in species and habitats that has been going on, and we do need to, as equally as addressing kind of carbon emissions, we need to be addressing this as an issue as well, in terms of how we restore nature as well. And if anything, I think the pandemic has highlighted to us the importance that we have in terms of relying on nature, if nothing else, in terms of high quality green spaces that we can access. So I'm just going to set out in a little bit more detail in terms of local nature recovery strategies. So this is a requirement under the Environment Bill, which is currently going through Parliament. So again, one of the government's key policies under the Environment Bill. And you might be aware that Buckinghamshire is one of 5 pilots that are being asked to test the production of these. That they're there to agree the priorities for nature's recovery predominantly, but they're also there to explore where nature's recovery can deliver wider environmental benefits, i.e. where can it help mitigate against climate change, where can it help mitigate against flood issues as well. So we're being asked to explore that as well. That they are spatial, so they will be seeking to identify where good is at the moment, and where we're looking to restore and create habitat as well, on a spatial element as well. So that we'll be looking to identify areas of land where we're looking to, I suppose, help restore habitat as well. So that is what they are. I suppose a bit about the why and when. So yes, we're being, as a pilot, we're being asked to test how these are going to be developed nationwide. So we're kind of testing the process of this, and some of you might have been parties to the stakeholder workshops that happened during February, which we ran to help get people's input into what, I suppose, people's priorities are for in respect to nature's recovery. So that's what you'll have seen. So local authorities will be required to produce these, and they will need to, I think, fit together to pull together a national nature recovery network. So that's in terms of what they are. We as a pilot will need to have kind of completed the work we've done by the end of kind of March, early April, to kind of pull together a kind of draft of what our local nature recovery strategy looks like. In terms of the kind of the who's involved, so at a local level, we have a pilot area team that importantly consists of all of our I suppose kind of key players. So we have our local wildlife trust, we have the Children's Conservation Board, we have kind of Natural England, our local nature partnership, the Environment Agency. So all of our kind of key bodies are working together as a pilot area team to kind of help pull together what makes sense in terms of where we're going with this as a I suppose as a group of people on the pilot team. But importantly, I think these are about shared creation. So this is going to be about input from numerous people in terms of making sure that we're getting this right. And in terms of just who the other pilots are, so yes, there's us, there's Cornwall, Cumbria, Greater Manchester and Northumberland in terms of who are testing this process. But fundamentally, they're supposed to be shared creations, because for this to work, it's going to need the buy-in of local communities, local organisations, land managers, farmers, to be able to achieve that level of change that is required to kind of deliver nature's recovery. So that is a bit about, I suppose, who's involved at a local level, and a bit about how they're intended to be used. So again, as I indicated, yes, shared creations, but they're going to be used clearly with the planning system. So I referred at the start to kind of the Biodiversity Net game being introduced into the planning system. So the idea is that this will help guide where those new areas to be, I suppose, habitats to be created are to happen, to be restored, and where payments that are made would be, I suppose, would be delivered. So fundamentally, the linkage is there with the planning system. But also, as I mentioned, in terms of the new environment land management system that's going to replace, I suppose, the common agricultural policy. This will, in terms of the financial, I suppose, incentives that are coming through there, this will help guide, I suppose, some of the payments that are being delivered under there. So In some ways, it's going to be a really key document in terms of, in a number of ways, in terms of how it helps guide investment. But clearly, it will need to be bought into by, I suppose, the organisations that are kind of going to be help using this, and all those who are involved in land management that are kind of help work together to deliver what is hopefully going to be a shared, I suppose, vision of how we're looking to kind of restore nature within, I suppose, Buckinghamshire. It will consist of two things, just very briefly. So a statement of biodiversity priorities, which will set out all that we have kind of our as is, i.e. all of our wildlife sites, all of our locally protected sites, but it will also set out where we are looking to kind of create. So our priorities are where we're looking to create and store, and likewise the actual map itself will look to set out, and I'll just show you here. So this is a kind of this is all of our current designated sites, our local wildlife sites, but it also set out as part of that where we are then looking to kind of create and restore habitat within the county. So that's in essence kind of what it's going to cover moving ahead. And as I said, it's not just, whilst biodiversity and nature's at its heart, again, linking out to the kind of wider climate change, this is about nature-based solutions potentially to kind of climate change. How can we use nature to help deliver, our wider environmental aims, whether it be in terms of mitigating flood, whether it be in terms of local climate regulation, to actually absorbing carbon. So how can we use nature to help deliver some of the solutions that we need? So that's all the thinking that we're all also doing as well. Just thinking in terms of other, I suppose, work we're doing, and I will go through this section relatively quickly, just in terms of conscious of time. So we've been, I'm just going to outline very quickly in terms of some of the other work we've done in terms of understanding the local environment, in terms of natural capital mapping, but again, linking it back to, I suppose, climate change and understanding how it fits in with climate change. And then I'll do a quick summary in terms of our biodiversity net gain before I kind of close up. So one of the issues we're aware of is that we weren't entirely sure what our natural assets, I suppose, were as an authority, and were we placing, I suppose, the correct value in terms of our decision making in respect to the role that the natural environment plays in respect of, I suppose, effectively our lives. So all the services that the natural environment provides to us, which, as I mentioned earlier, our clean water, our food, we don't really, as a decision making society, place value on the services that I suppose the natural world provides to us. So as a first point, we have recently mapped, I suppose, what our natural assets effectively look like. And we wanted an up-to-date baseline map, setting out all of our kind of natural assets. And we've done that to a very fine scale. So we've kind of pulled together a whole variety of data sets to pull this together. So we can actually kind of map all of our down to effectively like a field level in terms of all of our habitats and what that looks like at a field level. And we're able to kind of indicate in terms of, we now know that 63% arable grassland, 13% woodland, and we know that in terms of high quality habitats, we've only got about 13%, but only 5% of those have some form of level of protection. So that's just just an idea in terms of what the baseline is. And then I suppose the interesting bit that we've kind of got into then is in terms of, we then looked at, I suppose, all of the services that those natural assets provide us with, whether that be carbon storage, the ability to take on more carbon, the role that the natural environment plays in respect of kind of water flow regulation. So all those things that the natural environment provides to us, we then mapped, and I will just give you one example of what that looks like. So for instance, we've kind of mapped in terms of all of our natural habitats, where are the best performing habitats in terms of storing carbon. And so the map on the left here, probably not surprisingly, shows that it's our woodlands that are the best habitat for both storing carbon and probably, and the map on the right then indicates in terms of the habitats that are the best in terms of the ability to take on more carbon. So we know that different habitats have the ability to, store carbon, and all habitats have that ability, some better than others, and woodlands are probably the best at storing, and obviously the ability to take on more. So this is just one example of the map maps we've produced, I think just to understand that kind of what the role the natural environment does in terms of storing carbon and sequestering carbon. And just flicking back, we've produced maps, I think, for all of these. So just in terms of understanding the role that the environment plays in terms of all of these services that I suppose the nature provides to us. And we've then, I suppose, interestingly kind of gone on to the next step. If we're going to invest in the natural environment to, i.e. increase biodiversity, where can we invest in the natural environment potentially to kind of reduce surface water runoff to prevent flooding? Where can we invest in it to ameliorate air pollution? And where would it make sense to do that? So we've then kind of looked at numerous kind of opportunity mapping to help us understand where best that investment might take place. So again, just a couple of examples of what that might look like. And just to explain these, this is where would we invest if we were looking to kind of slow the flow of water, i.e. to prevent those issues of, where we've seen over last winter where high surface water runoff is kind of impacting in terms of environments, where would we seek to invest in the natural environment to kind of slow the flow? And we're starting to identify fields where it would make sense to do, I suppose, natural interventions, so natural flood management, to start doing that. So that just gives more of a strategic overview in terms of where to make those interventions. Likewise, biodiversity, where would it make sense to do it from a biodiversity perspective? And then finally, I suppose, if you were looking to kind of think about new woodland, where would it make sense to do that? And the map I'm showing here is then, if you are then looking to kind of introduce new woodland, where would it deliver multiple environmental benefits? And so the work we did then highlighted so that the redder the colour, the more environmental benefits it delivers, i.e. it sequesters carbon, it can deliver flood mitigation, so on and so forth. So that just, again, gives you an idea of where does it make sense to kind of do that and to make that investment on a logical basis. So it's a really key bit of work to help guide thinking kind of going ahead, and could help in terms of, certainly help inform, I suppose, thinking in terms of as we start perhaps looking towards the new local plan for Buckinghamshire. So that's just a quick overview of that piece of work. And I suppose just to finish up, I suppose, the kind of the section, I suppose, the presentation. So another key part of the Environment Bill kind of currently going through Parliament is the introduction of the requirement to deliver biodiversity net gain into the planning system. So this will require development to deliver a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain. So again, a fundamental shift in that, this will mandate developers to deliver a minimum of 10% net gain in the planning system in terms of their development. And we've been doing a lot of work with the Buckinghamshire and Milton Keynes Natural Environment Partnership to get ourselves ready to do that ahead of the national requirement. So they've been putting together an enormous amount of work to help us get ready. And last Friday or the week before, we've just launched a consultation on a supplementary planning document in terms of how we are envisaging that to kind of take place within the planning system, and how we are that expectation of developers and the process they would need to go through. So again, I would ask you to go and have a look at that. By all means, feed your comments back into us in terms of how that we're looking to do that. But again, that's another key, I suppose, element in terms of how we're looking to deliver change and how we're looking to deliver biodiversity kind of net gain or kind of nature's recovery back into Buckinghamshire. So that is I'm just going to, I suppose, finish I suppose on this slide in terms of my own kind of personal perspective, in that for us to thrive as an economy and a society, fundamentally it is reliant on a kind of a thriving natural environment, that they are inextricably linked. Hence why I suppose the presentation I've aimed it at, I've covered, yes, reducing emissions, but I've also kind of looked at the overall health of our natural environment as a wider aspect as well. Environmental infrastructure is essential. I think we need to be looking at it as such. So as equally as broadband infrastructure is essential, our environmental infrastructure is absolutely fundamental to us as a thriving society. And I sense that kind of shift in terms of how we invest in the natural environment on the back of that, in terms of, because we know it delivers multiple benefits in terms of climate change, biodiversity, how we connect with nature in terms of our own health and well-being, but as you say, but also the ability to support then economic growth as well, if done absolutely correctly. So that's kind of my take. So I hope in terms of that kind of summary, it's giving you an overview, I suppose, firstly on the the overall climate change strategy that we've presented to Cabinet in February. As you say, it is a draft, so I know there's going to be some engagement with, I think, the community boards ahead of the election. And I imagine it will come back again into Cabinet after the election. I've then given the link to the large-scale tree planting paper that went, and also, I suppose, to more detail on the local net recovery strategy and our biodiversity net gain. So I'm hoping I've not gone too much over time, Ed, and I shall close on that point in terms of opening up to questions. And I would say, Ed, I have not been looking at the comments that are coming in, just looking at this, so I don't know what comments have been coming in on the chat, Ed. So
that was brilliant, David. I can tell you one thing that's come through on quite a few of the comments is admiration for the vast amount of work you've done and the depth you guys have gone into it. So whatever people think of some of the results, I think they're very, very appreciative of that. And I think I'd like to just pick out one of the later comments even to start with. There's a slightly cheeky one, but I think it's probably worth saying with the amount of work you've done, is Mike Chadwick's asking, with all this vast amount of work that you're setting yourselves to do you think that your department and any resources you need to carry out this work, do you think you've got adequate resources, or should members of the public be lobbying councillors to ask for you to get more resource?
So good question. So resource is always an issue, and obviously one of the things we've gone through in terms of going through unitary, that has enabled us to kind of look at our structures in terms of, are they fit for purpose, and we have, obviously, as part of that process of setting up a new management team, we have kind of created a new climate change and energy function, so that there is now a team that has been set up to help support the implementation of, I suppose, various aspects. So, if I just look at one program, the tree planting program, that's a massive program in its own right, which, so we have tried to kind of put in place a management structure that's going to be able to help deliver some of this. But I think fundamental, to all of this, this is not one team that's going to deliver this. This will be, fundamentally, so yes, there's a team within, I suppose, our department, but every department, for instance, within the authority is going to be required to deliver aspects of the strategy. So that will require all the kind of the management across the authority to deliver that, to embed that in decision making. And likewise, a number of these things will require multiple partners to deliver. So this is not all about, I suppose, the authority delivering it. Yes, we might set some of the direction and travel, and I'm hoping that we're kind of putting in a structure that delivers that. There's a kind of a draft budget, which I think within the presentation I kind of highlighted, which set out the funding that would be associated with some of these measures. So we have tried to put forward what we think is a realistic but ambitious but deliverable program. Some of the other aspects, either the local net recovery strategy, yes, it's a pilot. We are going to have to work through how that's going to be implemented and funded. That's a piece of work we're going to have to work through together. So some of it's more worked up than others. So I'm hoping to some extent that's answered your question, Ed. Mike.
Great, thank you very much for that. And then another question that we just talked about right at the beginning, which then I'll just put as a general question. It's come out of a few of the questions later on as well. In Hazelmere, very simply, we looked at, from the parish point of view, at how we get ourselves as a parish to net zero 2030, and then we'll start working on the community. If the council did take a real emergency decision and decide firstly to get the council to net zero 2030, could you do it? How difficult would it be? And then I suppose a couple of comments on getting the county to net zero 2030.
So obviously the motion that went to full council in July last year, obviously that that was the motion that's guided where we've kind of got to, and that's, I suppose, the technical work that we've undertaken in terms of how would we get there. So that's, I suppose, what we've done. I think as part of the slide I highlighted earlier, I think there was an aspiration within, certainly from the own council's perspective, is that if we can get there earlier, we will try and do that. So, whilst yes, it is a 2050, clearly if we can go faster, we will try and do that. If we were asked to model, can we get to 2030? Yes, we would go away to do that. I imagine there would be a cost element to that in terms of, there would be a cost element to that in terms of what measures we would have to bring forward quicker. So yes, we could do that as a piece of work, but we would have to go in and do that as a technical piece of work. And I don't know what that would look like in terms of whether that is financially feasible or not. But but yes, in terms of the ambition, politically, there's been the target set for 2050. But if we can get there earlier, then that's what politically they've asked us to do. So that's kind of what we're working to. In terms of kind of county-wide, I think I would say, that is a lot more difficult to model, because clearly a lot of the things are going to be, impacted by national policy. So I'm thinking, a lot of the emissions are primarily transport emissions. And if you think, you've got the M40, the M25, a lot of the emissions are kind of going through which we don't necessarily have direct control over. So that fundamentally is going to be by a national policy steer in terms of that kind of switch to kind of how quickly we move to kind of that switch to a kind of electric vehicles. That's going to be set at a national, and likewise how quickly, for instance, moving away, retrofitting our housing stock in terms of those are national kind of policies which we're going to have to support, but yes, that's going to be more guided by national policy. So I think that one, there are elements that we can do, as I kind of indicated earlier, the local plan where we can have a, that regulatory function. But I think, overall, in terms of the kind of county-wide, you're much more linked to the I suppose, the country-wide trajectory to net zero, I suspect.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Going to one of the first questions, Ellen Hawes said, what are the current plans for a rollout of EV infrastructure across all residential areas in Bucks? Are grants being applied for on-street charging points? And how do people have a say over where the points are located? All about electric vehicle charging points. So,
good question. And again, this is probably one that I would need to get our colleagues in Transport Strategy to, I suppose, ping I can get an answer back for you on this one. So I know they pulled together kind of a draft, charging point strategy, which is, as you say, the full details of that in terms of, the on-street, whether that's in car parks, where, how quickly. That's probably one that I will need to kind of just get the full details back to you, because clearly I know there's a lot of work being done on that by our Transport Strategy colleagues. And that is, I suppose, in terms of, referring back to kind of who's implementing this. This is other departments that are rolling forward various aspects of this. So that's one for me to take away, and I think just to confirm the exact details of that or point you in the right direction as a follow-up.
Okay, great, thank you. And in fact, I have probably most people's emails and that here, so we'll be able to send it out to people afterwards as well. So,
yep.
Okay, on the figure of trees, 543,000 trees. Just out of interest, how was that figure selected by the council?
So that is I suppose, it was I suppose predominantly a political ambition. So that was one for every resident in the county. So that's, I suppose, was the starting point. As we've done our calculations, I think we've then realised, as you say, the role that quantity of trees plays in respect of its ability to absorb carbon in terms of offsetting our emissions. So I think we're aware that that's where the figure originated from.
Right.
But yeah, having them work through the kind of the detailed calculations, it's kind of clear that the role that will play in helping offset our emissions.
I mean, just because you happen to have led into it with that, having done a back of the envelope calculation after the 20 or 30 years that you mentioned on the emissions per hectare, that's only offsetting the emissions for about 10,000 people in Buckinghamshire. we'd have to plant a vast amount more trees to actually sequester a further amount of carbon. And could I just, sorry, the question that was later on is,
yep,
you had some fabulous figures on natural habitats, including
yep,
carbon sequestration.
yep.
Do you happen to know on all the natural habitats contained within Buckinghamshire what the total carbon sequestration is currently?
I suppose no is the answer to that. So we've mapped all the flows. Have we put a figure against it? No is the answer to that, I suppose. But we've kind of mapped in terms of which habitats perform best. I suppose just going back to your figure kind of I mentioned ago. So we know that. So if we took that, there's 200 hectares or there's 500,000 trees. So this was there, I suppose, to offset our own Buckinghamshire Council's emissions, as it were, in terms of its journey to that. By I think year 30 after they planted, they would be sequestering around about I think 1,500 tons per annum, which was enough to offset our emissions. But you're right, if you were then looking to kind of scale that up onto a kind of county-wide, clearly you'd have to go a lot farther. And that's the interesting aspect of where it links back into the local nature recovery strategies in terms of where would that be. So the trees we've identified here, this is Buckinghamshire Council offsetting its own emissions. This is clearly the local nature recovery strategy will hopefully look at where do we need to go in terms of other aspects in terms of county-wide.
Great, thank you. And I'm jumping ahead to somebody's question that was in the middle of the pack and I can't find it, but somebody was asking as well, do we have any take on the number of trees we would expect to lose in Buckinghamshire during the next 20 or 30 years based on HS2 developments, ash dieback, and anything else? So in other words, with the idea, I guess, of looking at if you're putting in 500,000 trees, but you're losing X amount, what's the total gain?
So, I mean, obviously we've looked at this on our own land holdings on our own right. So really good question. And I suppose just on the HS2 point, just to I suppose fundamentally put our position kind of out there, Buckinghamshire Council was opposed to this and remains opposed to it fundamentally from the very outset, partly because of the destruction that it's having on the local natural environment. So that position has not changed, albeit we've moved into one of making sure we get the best mitigation. So in theory, obviously, HS2 have come forward with their own mitigation package in terms of replacing trees. One of the aspects that we are looking, I think, to work out, and again linking to the I suppose the local nature recovery strategy, is understanding potentially the overall kind of I suppose loss of habitat from these kind of large scale infrastructure schemes and development, and where we need to, I suppose, where we need to create, and linked into the Biodiversity Net gain scheme. So that is a piece of work we are kind of looking at, or where we've probably not got the full answer to at the moment. So we've not done the full calculation of that, but other than that, clearly, HS2 have got their own mitigation in place that they're required to deliver to offset, I suppose. I think they are adopting a no net loss, rightly or wrongly in terms of that as an approach, but that's the approach they're taking. But yes, it's a piece of work I think we are looking to do, I think, to understand the overall habitats that we think we might need to have to recreate, I suppose, as part of the local nature recovery strategy.
Right, okay, thank you. I'm going to try and go down, and I'm just wondering, David, would you be prepared to stay for another 5 or 10 minutes? Perhaps we have lots of questions from different topics.
That's fine.
Would you be happy with that if we go on another 5 or 10 minutes? If people needed to leave, obviously that's fine.
Sure.
Okay. So just a comment from Libby James, as some from local and national government. From Sarah, as regarding new housing and planning, will gas boilers still be installed?
So there's a new, I'm trying to think of the right word here. There's a new home standard being introduced, whereby it'll prevent, I think with the next couple of years, it'll prevent any new home being built to have a kind of a gas boiler installed. So that, and again, I just again can confirm this, but it's a new home standard that's being introduced that will literally prevent, I suppose, new homes having a gas boiler installed. The idea being that they're obviously then having some sort of renewable heat source, whether that be a heat pump or whatever, installed as part of that. So that'll be a nationwide thing. So the new home standard.
Great. And then it's probably a related question. Libby James is asking, would the council be able to, I guess through planning, to ensure that all buildings are low carbon and that all houses are built to enable inhabitants to live a zero carbon life? Could that be done through the planning system locally?
So, there's two arguments here. So yes, it could be. So if you look at, some other authorities, on some conscious, like, the Greater London Authority, in terms of their local plan, they've got some really, ambitious low carbon policies in their local plan, in terms of kind of low carbon buildings. So yes, it can. You kind of can set that ambition. There is an argument: is it better done by building regs? So is that a better mechanism that will enable change quicker? So that's another argument, because obviously local plans are going at different paces in terms of areas, and we're potentially going into a kind of a new planning regime as well with the planning white paper. So yes, it can, and there are authorities who are, I suppose, introducing really ambitious, I suppose, low carbon policies within their local plans. But is there an option that it could be done through kind of building regs as well? Is that another option? So.
Okay, great, thank you. Alan Thorley's asking, would it not be better to focus our scarce resources on near-term emissions cuts rather than spending over half the climate change fund on tree planting, which will not achieve its full carbon sequestration potential for many years, particularly when even better results in terms of biodiversity could be achieved with a rewilding approach, presumably at a fraction of the cost?
So in terms of the budget, I think we've plotted out the journey that we would need to take. So it is a combination of measures. So there's a variety of building measures in there. There's a recognition the tree planting is going to take longer, but within there's a package of measures that are covering building, are covering our fleet, how we work with suppliers. So I'm hoping we have put forward a balanced picture of what we're looking to do. And absolutely, in terms of, are there aspects in terms of, rewilding where we just need to kind of leave a piece of land to kind of naturalize? I am sure there are. And again, I'd like to think, as part of the local nature recovery strategy, we will look at that and where that's appropriate. And as we kind of design the creation plans for the woodlands we're looking at, that will be done purely on the basis of what's right for that particular area. So it could be that in terms of, it's not going to be a block of trees. This is about kind of pulling together spaces that are right for its location, right for the people that live nearby, right for the biodiversity. So I think that that will have a place. But I think the overall package of measures that we've kind of has been presented does cover a broad aspect of buildings, fleet, street lighting, and so on and so forth. So I'd like to think it is a relatively balanced program that we've put together.
Okay, great, thank you. There have been a couple of comments about LED street lighting. So just pulling one comment of somebody local saying, pleased to say that Hazemere Parish Council has used interest-free loans to fund their LED street lighting, which is all done. And then somebody else later on was asking, what is the split between Parish Council's responsibility for their lighting and Bucks Council? And what could Bucks be doing to encourage more of the parish councils to get their LED lighting changed over?
So good question. So in terms of the funding that we're using to replace the street lighting, primarily it's we're using the Salix fund, which is a kind of an interest-free, because the payback on this is so good. We're using the kind of a Salix fund, which is like a rotating fund, to kind of help finance this. In terms of the parish council split, again, that's probably one I need to come back to you on in terms of how that works, because obviously, as you some parishes obviously have that responsibility for looking after their streetlights. I am pretty sure that the Salix fund is equally applicable to supporting parishes in terms of replacing with LEDs as well. But that's probably one I would just need to come back to you on, Ed.
And our parish council use Salix, so it certainly would be.
Yeah.
So, the David Banks asks, Bucks is investing 63 million in fossil fuel companies. Would you see us moving away from these investments, which even Mark Carney regards as risky now? I suspect that's about a pension investment that David is talking about.
So, that's probably not one I'm going to answer. That is that's one for, a member question. That's for our pensions. If that is a pension related one, that's not, that's not one I kind of feel.
Absolutely, that's fine. I thought I'd put it to you anyway, but I was quite anticipating the answer, so that's fine. And we know that you're not one of the politicians. So thank you, David. Sarah's asking, nature decline not helped by HS2. So I'm wondering how Bucks Council is working with HS2, especially as regards woodland, habitat, water and flooding. I know you alluded to it a bit earlier on. Maybe you could just explain how the work goes on with HS2 to try and improve whatever they're doing.
So yeah, I mean, as you say, fundamentally we are opposed, partly because just the destruction that we're kind of seeing. So, but we've worked to try and put together with HS2 in terms of mitigation package, and that work carries on. So we're working very closely. So there's an HS2 team at Buckinghamshire Council that's been set up and has recently just been expanded to try and ensure that we're holding HS2 to account in terms of what it said it's going to do, the standards it's operating to, and obviously the mitigation that's putting in place. That there are limits to that in terms of that it's quite sweeping powers that have been granted to HS2. So there's a limit of what we can do, but clearly that there is that ongoing liaison that we're doing, and we have a kind of a meeting kind of set up with kind of ourselves, with kind of Natural England, Children's Conservation Board, just regularly to make sure that we as a group of local organisations are informed in terms of what's coming up. Have we got sight what's coming up? Are we happy with what is being proposed? So I think bearing in mind the limited resource we've kind of got for this, I think we're doing as best as we can in terms of making sure that we're holding HS2 to account in terms of the standards they're operating to and the mitigation they're kind of putting in place.
Okay, great, thank you. Mike's asked, you mentioned a couple of times that the measures and strategy have been assessed in terms of carbon savings, and they'll be delivered and costed. Are there the documents available with the background to these calculations?
I missed the first bit of that, Ed. You broke up. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. You mentioned a couple of times that the measures in the strategy have been assessed in terms of the carbon savings they will deliver and costed. Are the documents setting out this analysis available? So,
I mean, obviously the publicly available documents are the ones that were, I suppose, on the website that supported the kind of climate change strategy, which included the carbon audit. So the carbon audit is quite a long report that kind of sets out how we've measured our emissions and what we need to do in terms of our emissions going ahead, so in terms of how we're kind of measuring those. So in terms of the publicly facing documents, they are the kind of the ones that I think supported the report that went to Cabinet.
Okay, thank you. Has there been any assessment of the decline of pollinators and how this is affecting county crop yields?
As a specific study, then no, other than that we know that obviously pollinators are in decline, but we've not done a specific study in respect of bucks and the impact that's having. I would just perhaps make reference to the local nature partnership. So they've kind of got a bucks buzzing element of their website, which is all about in terms of how we can help support, I suppose, pollinators locally. So, there is a section on our kind of local nature partnership website that's all about pollinators and Buckinghamshire, but I don't believe we've done a specific study in terms of any, I suppose, measuring that local decline.
Okay, thank you. And in fact, Bucks Buzzing are brilliant. They are actually cooperating with us on our bee corridor.
That's great. Glad to hear that.
So we're in touch with them. Sally J has asked, what's Bucks County policy on verge cutting? Is it a policy to try and encourage flowers on roadside by reduced cutting? How about no mow May?
So again, very good question. And again, this is probably one I can send a link to afterwards. So again, we're working really closely with our local nature partnership, and we've kind of brought in expertise learning from other authorities who've probably more advanced on this than we are, i.e., so I know we've been working with Dorset in terms of how we can improve the management of our verges in terms of for wildlife and I suppose our mowing regimes. So, I'm conscious that Transport for Buckinghamshire has clearly reduced the level of mowing over recent years, but I think predominantly that's been done from a budgetary perspective. But I think we're now looking at working with them on a much more, proactive basis of how we're, managing our verges for wildlife. So we're looking at a number of pilot sites to take forward. We're looking, I think, to buy so for instance, I know we're going to need to buy a little piece of kits in terms of how we kind of take away the cuttings in terms of when we do cut it. I think just to make sure we're maximizing, I think the biodiversity potential. So again, this is another project we're working very closely with our local nature partnership and with our colleagues in TFB to say, how do we get ourselves into a better place in respect of verge management? But it's a piece of work we're actively doing.
Great. And just connected with that, are you looking at tree planting into verges?
So, in short, I mean, clearly highway trees are, a really important part of the landscape, and remain so in terms of, so fundamentally, I suppose, yes, because, if you look at the changes that are coming forward in the planning system, the recent documentations coming out from government, they're looking for every new street to be lined with trees. So that's kind of one of the government's ambitions, recognizing the role they play. So, street trees are fundamentally important. And we have, our colleagues in TFB manage a very large asset in terms of trees, and they've committed to, replacing those that kind of come out, whether they're being diseased or dying. One, I suppose, piece of work I would maybe just point in the direction of in terms of any thinking that you might having in terms of, so we were approached by Relief Haddenham and Relief Marlow, which were kind of two local community schemes that had aspirations in terms of how do they undertake some kind of planting, but which was also, I suppose, on the highway of, I suppose, the highway extent, and they were coming across, a number of barriers in terms of to do that, whether that be licensing, whether that be in terms of, scanning for services. And they were saying, right, well, how do we work with you to be able to do that? And so we've kind of set up a very small task and finish group, utilizing, I suppose, Haddenham and Marlow as kind of pilots to say, right, how do we almost get a toolkit that we can be able to demonstrate to other, I suppose, communities that are interested in doing this, that, right, these are the things that I suppose we can, I suppose, almost unblock to help deliver that. Because I'm conscious what we don't want to do is, each of these community schemes that are coming forward to be coming across the same issues. Right, I need to get a license to do this. How do we do this? So I think we're looking to run these as pilots to say, right, this is almost a toolkit. If you as a local group want to do your own local tree planting on a verge, this is the kind of the way to do it. So that's a piece of work we're doing. Is almost a bit of a small task and finish group with our, our environment team, our kind of our arboriculturalists, transport for bucks, but also just a kind of a couple of these community groups just to kind of iron out these issues.
And actually, I'd just like to add to that. That is very, very welcome, and it's something that both myself and I can see. Actually, there's somebody from Haddenham, Alan, on the call from, and Haddenham have declared a climate emergency, and that we've specifically talked about is trying not to keep reinventing the wheel.
Yeah.
The more that we can just cut the approach to all these things and take it from one group to another, it would be wonderful. And if we could have your help on that, that would be fantastic.
So I think, which is what we're trying to do. So I think we're just trying to get this toolkit to say, if there is that aspiration to plant locally, and it's on, the highway verge, this is almost the process. This is the kind of the toolkit to follow, and it could be, would link into that, just in terms of other aspects of, for instance, community board funding that might link into that as well. So I think we're looking at in terms of the overall element, in terms of finance, but also the things that potentially might be barriers in terms of how we can help unlock that as an authority.
Brilliant. No, that's great to hear. And I'm going to really, if you don't mind 1 or 2 more minutes, I'm going to get really short summaries of questions, and you can very short answers, and we'll get through a couple more. So Alan had just asked, actually, as we move on from the council's own emissions, and start to think about county-wide emissions, are there any plans in the pipeline to introduce concrete targets with associated budgets for addressing these county-wide emissions?
So in the short answer, no. I mean, to be honest,
no, that's fine.
Because I think that would be a national thing. If it was going to go down to regional targets, carbon, I would suspect that would need to be some sort of national policy that says we're allocating a kind of a budget to you in terms of, and I don't necessarily, we're not necessarily seeing that kind of coming nationally. So yeah. Okay,
so no to local at the moment on that. So thank you. Right. Yes, just a quick one. Somebody was asking, the ecosystem services and habitat opportunity mapping that you've done is amazing. Is it on a website?
So the report is on or it should be soon, the local nature partnership website. So yeah, the report is kind of there. It is almost a feasibility, but it does kind of, it is a stepping stone in terms of helping informing us in terms of next steps. So there's nothing hard and fast about it. It's not been approved. It's kind of almost just setting out a feasibility and a mapping exercise of understanding, I suppose, the role that our kind of environment provides. So yes, but the report should be on the Local Nature Partnership website, if for those that want to have a look at it.
Great. I'm going to try and push a number of questions into a same question now. Richard Murphy's asking, and I'll ask his question first and then add on a couple of bits. How do we balance the need to build more housing and associated infrastructure with the need to protect woodland and biodiversity? And there are a number of questions then that came on. How do we prevent people extending their 4-bedroom house into a mansion, covering up with more concrete areas of grass or whatever next to their houses, and people then talking about taking out again ecosystems? And added into that, should we be continuing to build more houses around on our woodlands and green areas, or should we be densifying? Questions in one, all connected.
That's quite a big question, but so I don't see the two things as kind of mutually exclusive. Personally, I kind of think good design can incorporate. It should be about incorporating or getting us, I suppose, to incorporate, I suppose, elements of environment into good design in terms of how we're building development. So for me, this is about delivering good development, if that makes sense. So I don't see the two as mutually exclusive. Clearly, yes, we need to obviously protect our best assets, as it were. That's a fundamental part of the planning system in terms of protecting what's good. But in terms of the design of new, so for me, this is fundamentally about how we kind of design in the environment in terms of I suppose into development, and that I suppose is the essence of Biodiversity Net Gain. This is about getting developers to think about how they're looking to deliver that as part of their design solutions for sites. So yes, fundamentally yes, protect our assets, as it were, in terms of our woodlands, but in terms of how we incorporate nature into the design of development, fundamentally that should be a part of our thinking. And you look at the guidance that's coming out from government, it is all about moving to kind of high quality design, incorporating nature into kind of spaces that we're developing. And I didn't catch the second part of your question, Ed, about because you broke up.
People have been mentioning concreting over of gardens, creating carports and everything else, which is removing biodiversity. The last bit was, should we be thinking about densifying? So perhaps instead of the 4-bedroom house being extended for one family to live in, perhaps another small house should be being built right next to it or being incorporated into it, so 2 houses could live in it, densifying rather than spreading onto other land.
Okay. In terms of the kind of the concreting over drives, I'm pretty sure there's guidance on that. And again, probably on our sustainable drainage. So, we manage the lead local flood authority, and within there's our sustainable drainage team. And I'm pretty sure there's guidance on there in terms of as and when, permissions required in terms of, square meterage, in terms of just to kind of for that, in terms of knowing the impact that has. Densification. yeah, that's kind of a spatial strategy kind of one, I suppose, just to think about. And I'm thinking in terms of the thinking that's gone behind some of the local plans in terms of where you kind of the spatial model you kind of look at. That's an option. Yeah, I'm not sure that's quite a cohesive answer, Ed, but
no, that's fine. That's fine. And I suspect we've fired a lot of questions at you. So I think we'll make this the last sort of main question. Then I'll add one or two comments from people. So slightly different topic. So William Dowling's asked, I understand the rollout of 5G will involve many more small, powerful cell towers being put up in front of every third to fifth house in the worst case, instead of the existing large masts every few miles. In addition, 5G is far more sensitive to screening by trees, which is likely to result in more tree cutting. How much say does Buckinghamshire local authority have on the location and number of telecom masts for 5G in their area?
Good question, and one I probably don't feel sufficiently informed about to be able to answer, other than I suspect that there are probably a number of permitted development rights that kind of go with that. But again, that's probably the one I don't feel sufficiently informed about to answer, Ed, I have to say.
Okay, fine, fair enough. So in fact, just out of interest, who would be a question like that?
I mean, again, that would, I suppose, it would be understanding in terms of the permitted development rights in terms of statutory undertakers, in terms of what, as and when it would need plan permission, but as and when it will be carried out under permitted development rights. So it's probably just something we'd need to go away and have a look at. It's not an area I come across close, enough to be able to be informed about, but I could go away and have a look at.
Okay, great. Well, I think we'll draw it to a close. You've been incredibly patient, David. Thank you so much. You've worked very hard, a lot of different questions. I just noting somebody's comment. So Rafiq has said, my intention is that everyone needs to realise they can play a part in helping to avert disaster down the line, which of course is so true. I actually had mentioned, I think in an earlier question, about how virtually everybody who's listening today is obviously interested in the topic and would like to help. That's pretty much why everyone's here. Is there a message that you could give to people about how they can help you? I mean you personally, but you as in Buckinghamshire Council get these things done. Is there support that people could give, lobbying they could give, people they can talk to? What could they do to help you get your job done?
So you're right. I mean, everyone has a role to play in terms of this aspect. I think one of the interesting things will be from you as a kind of a community is in terms of where you think you might need things unlocking from a local authority's perspective. So we talked about the tree planting. I think it'd be really interesting to hear where your thinking is, where you think I suppose the local authority might be able to help. I'm conscious we're having decisions with community boards coming up in terms of their role in respect to kind of climate change environment. They have a budget, and I imagine that some of their budget will be allocated towards environment, to much more kind of localized implementation. So I think it'll be interesting almost to reflect it back in terms of where you think, I suppose, you need the help as a local group in terms of your thinking, and okay, we've got this. I don't know what your thoughts might be, but perhaps just that reflection back to us in terms of where you think as a local authority we may be able to assist in terms of unblock things. So it'd be interesting to hear from that. But you're right, fundamentally we all have a role to play in terms of the choices we're making. Specifically as a community, it'll be interesting to kind of reflect back in terms of just what your plans are and where you think that interaction with our local authority might be, and perhaps some of the unblockers that we might be able to help with.
That's great. And in fact, I think seeing some of the people on this talk, we've got representatives of the Beaconsfield and Chepping Wickham Community Board. Those on the Wickham Community Board, we've got Hazelmere, who's declared a climate emergency, and as I said, one person from Haddenham. I think it would be great actually for us to create a list of those areas where we think we need some help on unblocking, and then put it forward to you and see if there's things you can suggest on how we can do that. That would be great, and we can put it together, all of us, make a long list rather than 4 or 5 different lists coming at different times, and then try and help everyone at the same time.
That'd be good.
Brilliant. Yes, we'll try and do that. So, David, thank you so much. You've been extremely patient. We've kept you a lot longer than we have kept our other speakers. There was obviously a huge amount of interest. There's still even 11 new messages coming in while I'm talking. I suspect some of them are thank yous to you, but others may be questions. So thank you so much for doing that. That was absolutely wonderful. I would remind everybody who's here that we are next month, so the first Monday of April, the talk will be by the Hazelmere projects we're doing. So if everybody would like to come, both from the community, but actually those as well from the other communities around us, where we don't mind taking questions or giving pointers to people on trying to get their project started or getting advice from them, that would be brilliant. So we're going to be presenting what we're doing in the next talk. So again, thank you so much, David, for doing that. That was brilliant, very patient. Thank you for answering all the questions. Thank you, everybody, for turning up. So bye-bye.